Welcome to day 2, everybody, the National Wilderness Workshop. We're here after a successful coffee hour. So if you didn't join us this morning, plan on coming tomorrow, where we're going to talk about your wilderness challenges. And we have a special guest who's going to be joining us. So come tomorrow to find out who that is. Just a reminder that this will be a webinar format through the rest of today. So you'll be able to see and interact with our panelists, but our audience will pretty much be hidden from view. You can request, raise a hand, or through the chat, you could request permission to talk at some point if we get opportunity for questions. But typically we use the Q&A feature to ask questions as we go forward. You can use the chat to pretty much talk to the panelists or to everybody. We're going to ask that you stay muted. Presenters, just be careful about when you're muted and not muted, so we can have a good session for everybody. And the session is being recorded, so you'll be able to see it later on in the week. Just as a reminder, today we've had our coffee hour. This session is about defining future directions for wilderness research. We'll then move into an effort to look at future wilderness research needs through participatory methods. Then at 2 o'clock Eastern time, we'll have 3 wilderness stewardship case studies. And at 4, we'll have our Magnifying Your Advocacy Impact with Diana Christopoulos and Rupert Cutler, Gwen Mason, and Peter Larkin. So looking forward to the rest of the day. Go ahead and take it away. Chris Armitage from the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Center, Research Station, is our moderator for this session. So Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Randy, for that intro. Thanks everybody for being here. Really good to be here. So I'll quickly get out of the way and get on to our great group of speakers. But just to give you a little introduction, we're going to really focus on defining the future directions of wilderness research. Wilderness research and science is a big part of how we steward wilderness lands, trying to understand, a variety of issues, whether it's what opportunities for solitude, unconfined or primitive recreation is, or, when do we intervene and think about wildness versus naturalness? All those things are part of wilderness research, and we've got a great group of folks today who are going to speak to some of that. And so, I won't talk very much at all, other than to say I will quickly introduce each of the speakers individually, and then, but I'll just start with the speakers first. They're going to speak for 8 to 10 minutes each, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end and discussion. And while we're swapping screens, I'll introduce each individual speaker. So today we are starting first with, according to my order, and correct me if I'm wrong, folks, but Jaclyn, you're up first, right? And so we're going to start with Jaclyn Rushing. She's a PhD student from the University of Montana, who focuses on protected area and outdoor recreation management, with a dissertation focus on wilderness relevance, diversity, and inclusion of Latinx communities. And I did put in the chat, I don't know if you all saw it, the speaker biographies. I won't do the full speaker bio. You can go there to get the full story if you'd like. So Jaclyn, you have share screen capabilities, and I will just say, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. All right. Uh-oh, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Just give me a second.
All right, Randy's on the case, working out the kinks first thing in the morning. Hope everybody has their coffee, or this afternoon for some of you out east, your lunch. Just give us 1 sec.
All right, go ahead there, Jaclyn.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. Can you all see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Yes, ma'am.
Great. All right, so thanks again for the introduction, Chris. In order to kind of establish an idea of where we should move forward with wilderness research, it's important to look at where we have been. And so Chris, Dr. Will Rice, Jen Thompson, and I came together to do a scoping review of wilderness visitor use management research in the last 20 years in order to develop a way to move forward researching visitor use management in the next 20 years, hopefully, which Elena will talk about next. There we go. All right, so what is wilderness visitor use management? Visitor use management is the proactive and adaptive process for managing characteristics of visitor use and the natural managerial settings using a variety of strategies to maintain desired resource conditions and visitor experiences. And previous wilderness VUM research explored the field in 1987 and in 2000 and 2012. And tasked with creating a research agenda and a visitor experience survey instrument for the Park Service, we wanted to look back at the last 20 years and also understand in the context of the 21st century, we're in a really pivotal time in research, visitor use research and management right now. We have global pandemics, which are driving increased visitation to wilderness areas with new recreationists. We also are facing climate change. And so there's the time is ripe to look forward at what has been studied and what has not, so that we can start working on filling up those gaps. So we did this review with two major research questions in mind. The first was, what are the major themes of the research that have defined the last 20 years? And what areas of research, places, and management agencies have not been studied very much in the last 20 years? And so we conducted a scoping review. A scoping review of literature gives you the general landscape, what has been studied, what hasn't been studied, what methodologies have been used. It doesn't engage in understanding the quality of the research or conducting meta-analysis between the research items. We looked at 4 different databases and 4 targeted journals, and the things that we included as research items needed to be published in the last 20 years in English with a primary focus of visitor use management in federally designated wilderness. So this excludes proposed wilderness and recommended wilderness. It needed to be published as research, not as a commentary or an editorial. For each of the research items or the publications, we collected metadata, including the publication outlet, the year it was published, which wilderness unit, agency, methodologies. And as a research team, we worked really closely to code for themes that we found common among the research items and themes within those themes. And we kept in very close contact to make sure all of our coding and our themes were very reliable. So our search yielded 263 studies. 86% of those were empirical, and of those, 83% were field-based, 72% were quantitative, 16% were qualitative, and 12% engaged in mixed methods. So a combination of qualitative and quantitative research, which can look like surveys as quantitative, interviews as qualitative. You'll notice that these percentages don't add up to 100. A lot of these research items are not mutually exclusive, and they fall into a number of different categories. So keep that in mind moving forward. So the major themes of research inquiry that we found are these 8 here in order of popularity: visitor experience research being the most popular, and stewardship research being the least popular. And I'll go through these very briefly. So visitor experience research focused on emotional and behavioral facets of the wilderness experience, like motivations, conflicts, preferences for settings. Crowding and high use was the most popular area of research within visitor experience, and the least popular were soundscapes and view sheds. Wilderness character, this research focused on traditional wilderness qualities described by the Act. Natural and solitude, or primitive and unconfined, were the most popular areas of research. And the least popular area of research was other features of value. Visitor use. This research focused on how visitors move through a wilderness area. It looks at behavior patterns, volume or visitor counts. Travel patterns was the most popular area of research within visitor use. Visitor demographics and characteristics was the least popular. And interestingly, a lot of the research in the early 2000s really focused on similarities and differences between overnight users and day users. Planning and policy research focused on management and policy, management options, manager perspectives, policy alignment. Support for management actions was the most popular area of research within this theme. And then risk assessment, conflict resolution, and stakeholder engagement was the least popular. Recreation ecology. This research focused on environmental impacts resulting from recreation in wilderness. Items within this code are focused on non-human things like soil, vegetation. Campsite impacts was by far and away the most popular area of study within this category. Water impacts and wildlife impacts were the least popular. Methodology research focused on developing or testing new methodological approaches to wilderness. You can see here modeling, spatial analysis, indicator and standard development were the most popular. Visitor surveys were the least. Relevancy and additional values research focused on values of wilderness not explicitly represented in the Act, and also non-traditional or underrepresented wilderness users. So within this theme, constraints for underrepresented wilderness users and the values that they have for wilderness represented the most popular area of study. And then you can see other values of wilderness, spirituality, place values, technology, where that comes into play, Native American values, and then subsistence and land management. Stewardship. This research focused on ethical behaviors and intentions to support improving conservation of wilderness. So education and social learning was the most popular, and behavior related to protecting the resource was the least. For that second research question, looking at what areas haven't been studied, as far as administering agencies, we can see here, Bureau of Land Management has been grossly understudied in the last 20 years. It accounted for only 3 studies that we looked at, so 1.5% of the research, and it accounts for 32.4% of wilderness areas. National Park Service was overrepresented by a lot as well. 34%, 35% of the research, and 7.6% of wilderness areas. Forest Service was right on par, 56% of the research and 56% of wilderness areas. And then US Fish and Wildlife Service accounted for 3.5% of the research and about 9% of wilderness areas, so understudied. And this might be in part, this trend might be in part due to mission statements. We realize that National Park Service has a mission that's very visitor experience focused. And we can look at this spatially too. So here's a map of the US. The denominator for each state indicates the number of wilderness areas, and the numerator indicates the number of research items in the last 20 years. So you can see states like Minnesota have 3 times the number of research items as they do wilderness areas. And then states like New Mexico with 39 wilderness areas haven't had any research on visitor use management in the last 20 years. And you can look at the number of research items per wilderness area as well. So we see that a lot of, here, the larger the dot, the more research that has occurred in that wilderness area. And often the same places are studied over and over again, which is great. But there is also a need to look at some of these other wilderness areas, many of which are urban proximate and haven't received as much attention by research. So in conclusion, wilderness research has covered substantial ground in the last 20 years. Future research should continue to monitor previous areas of study like campsite degradation and crowding, but should also respond to the changing world and look at climate change and how that affects visitor experience, stewardship, and relevancy. Monitoring and research should also continue in the areas that have been very popular in the last 20 years, but there should be more focus on Bureau of Land Management and Fish Wildlife Service administered areas, as well as urban proximate wilderness. So thank you so much, and I'll be able to answer questions after Elena talks about the future directions of this review.
Thanks, Jaclyn. Appreciate that. Yeah, so we are going to hold questions kind of for the end, and you can throw them in the chat sooner rather than later, and maybe we can get to them before that. But we'll now move along to Elena as she's sharing her screen. Elena's a master's student at the University of Montana and earned a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology and Religion in 2013 from the University of Florida. And so today, her research interests really include public and protected area management, visitor demand of recreational ecosystem services, and place attachment and place bonding. So Elena, I don't know, hopefully you can share, and we'll move into your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for that introduction. Let's see here. I'm going to try to share. Let's see here. Can you guys all see that?
Yep, looks good.
Awesome. So I'm going to be talking today about the transdisciplinary development of our standardized National Park Service Wilderness Visitor Use Survey instrument that we are piloting in Everglades National Park early next year. Just a little bit of background. Like Jaclyn talked about, the research team conducted a literature review that identified some under-researched wilderness areas in the country. You can see here it's the same graphic that Jaclyn used. There are certain areas of the country that have not had a lot of research done, especially in some of the coastal areas and in the south. You can see that there has not been a lot of wilderness research done in Florida, for instance. So the National Park Service approached the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute and the University of Montana to develop a survey instrument that could be used specifically in a national park wilderness area to answer questions that managers may have, but also it'll be a standardized survey instrument that can be used across the board in every national park wilderness area. So Everglades National Park in Florida was chosen as a place to pilot this survey. It has a lot of those under-researched qualities that we talked about. It's coastal, it's in the southern US, it's also urban proximate, and it's really close to Miami. It is over 97% designated wilderness or potential wilderness. It contains the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Wilderness Area, which is a partially submerged marine wilderness. So that's a super unique quality that kind of makes it unique from other wilderness areas in the country. The last visitor use survey was done there in 2008. So managers have a lot of questions that hopefully the survey will be able to answer. Just a little bit about the kind of process of developing the survey. The research team consists of the National Park Service Denver Service Center, Everglades National Park, and managers, the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, and Dr. Chris Armitage, and the University of Montana team, which consists of Dr. Will Rice, Dr. Jen Thompson, Jaclyn Rushing, and myself. So this whole process kind of started early this year in February, and we were meeting regularly until late September. We had about 11 meetings in total that were 1 to 2 hours each. We mostly were meeting over Zoom, but there was a lot of emailing back and forth. So really there's been a tremendous amount of collaboration. It's pretty rare to have this amount of involvement from everybody on developing a survey like this. And it was a really awesome opportunity to be able to get everyone's insight and input, and in the end come up with a survey that we all are really proud of and happy with. So for the next couple slides, I'm just going to be talking about a couple question batteries that we included in the survey and kind of how certain items are added or adapted to assess visitor perceptions of wilderness. This is the first question, question 15 in the survey. It's a recreation experience preference scale question. It asks, please rate how true the following statements are according to your trip in Everglades wilderness areas. And it just lists a whole bunch of different motivations that visitors may have coming to Everglades wilderness areas. And a lot of these desired motivations and outcomes are taken from Rogan, Buck, and Driver's research, among others. Some of them include personal development and growth, social identity, enjoying nature. And then there are a couple items here on the bottom that are specifically related to some of those wilderness character qualities that Jaclyn mentioned. Those character qualities are taken from the Keeping It Wild framework. And the 4 qualities that we kind of use in the survey are naturalness, unconfined and solitude, untrammeled and undeveloped. So the last couple items here in this battery, experience minimal rules, roam wherever I want, make my own plans, and gain new experience. Those are getting at that unconfined quality. And the first one, experience minimal rules, that was kind of an interesting one. Originally we had in there experience no rules, but Everglades National Park managers were not satisfied with that. They didn't think it represented how they managed the park. And so we did end up changing it to experience minimal rules. That's just kind of an example of how we kind of went back and forth and refined these question batteries so that everybody was happy with what we ended up with. And the next question, question 16, this is getting at visitor perceptions of those wilderness character qualities that we talked about. Again, those are naturalness, solitude, and unconfined, untrammeled, and undeveloped. The question asks, how did the following conditions you may have experienced add or detract from your experience in Everglades wilderness areas? And it just lists a whole bunch of different conditions. You know, for example, we have hearing and seeing other people on the trail, hearing and seeing other people while camping, absence of internet connectivity. Those are all qualities or conditions that are related to the solitude quality. And then we have a couple items that are kind of a mixture of different qualities. And we did try to make these items specific to Everglades National Park wilderness areas. But a lot of these items could be adapted and changed for the different National Park wilderness area if the standardized survey is taken there. This next question, question 18, is getting at visitor perceptions of barriers and constraints. It asks, do you experience any barriers in your life that keep you from spending more time in Everglades wilderness areas? And this is connected to the second part of our study that I'll talk a little bit about more later. We will be conducting qualitative interviews in the greater Miami area with traditionally marginalized and underrepresented groups. And we will be asking them about potential barriers and constraints they're experiencing. So that'll really give us a lot more qualitative information to kind of supplement this question. This is our last question battery that I included. This question is asking about visitor perceptions of different management actions that may impact wilderness character. So there have been a lot of studies that have researched how different management actions may impact wilderness character. So, you know, the manager builds a boardwalk, puts in a boardwalk. How is that going to impact the wilderness quality of undeveloped, for instance? But there have not been many studies that have focused on visitor perceptions of those management actions. So this is going to be an extremely important question for managers, and it's going to be able to get at how visitors are perceiving how wilderness is managed and what kind of management actions they would like to see for the wilderness qualities that they care about. So an example of one of the items is actions that preserve or improve recreation opportunities free from rules and regulations. So that's getting at that unconfined wilderness character quality. Okay, so the survey is currently in the OMB approval process, and we are hoping to conduct it in Everglades National Park early next year from January to March. That is peak season in Everglades. There is currently another ongoing scoping literature review that is focused on barriers and constraints, specifically to visitation of federally designated wilderness, and hopefully seeing what constraints, if any, are specific to wilderness. And then we will be conducting those qualitative interviews in the Miami area with traditionally underrepresented marginalized groups that may have a relationship with Everglades National Park, or they may not be visiting. And we will be asking them kind of about their relationship with wilderness, any barriers and constraints they may experience, and how they negotiate those constraints. So yeah, really looking forward to seeing what we find, and stay tuned for the results.
Great. Thank you, Elena. All right, next up, we're going to kind of transition and try to use our time efficiently so we can get on to the Q&A. We have Stephanie Freeman, who's a PhD candidate in the Recreation, Park, and Tourism Department at Penn State University. Her research focuses on park and protected area management, human-wildlife conflict and coexistence, and environmental communication. So the goal of this research generally is to support positive outcomes for people and wildlife and coupled human-natural systems. All right, so I will pass it on.
Chris, while Stephanie is getting loaded up, we do have one question that might be appropriate. Okay. Is there a centralized location for wilderness research that people can tap into?
Yeah, Randy, that's a good question. I did put an answer. I don't know if it came through, but I can again. There's just the Leopold Institute website's a good place to start, but I'll follow up and make sure that that's visible to everybody. And so take it away, Stephanie. Thanks.
Awesome. Can you hear me?
Yep, and see the slides. Looks good.
Wonderful. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie, and today I will be presenting on food storage on the Appalachian Trail, a theory of planned behavior approach to understanding backpacker bear canister use. And so just a quick introduction here to the topical area. So we were focusing specifically on human black bear conflicts that occur along the Appalachian Trail. And so broadly, improper food storage does fuel incidents between people and bears in various park and protected area settings. And so the impacts of food conditioning bears can be deleterious for both wildlife and people. Food conditioned bears can, of course, become sick, aggressive, and lose their drive to forage, as well as injure people and damage property. And so proper food storage behaviors can help to decrease conflicts between people and bears in backcountry and wilderness areas. I don't know why our screen is going black here. Can you guys see the content?
Black for me. Oh, there it goes.
Here we go. Okay, sorry about that. So in terms of proper food storage in these contexts, there are numerous methods, of course, that do exist. For instance, tree hangs that hoist bear bags up out of reach, as well as management provided bear boxes. And so the issue here is that bears often overcome such methods when they are incorrectly implemented. So for instance, due to human error, sometimes these tree hangs are too close to trunks or too low to the ground, and bears can gain access to human food. And also in terms of management provided infrastructure, such as bear boxes, there can also be issues when there is insufficient space available for folks. And so bear canisters are a very effective and reliable method of bear-resistant food storage that is very appealing to managers, as the effectiveness of bear canisters is independent of site characteristics. Bear canisters don't rely on the presence of trees, for instance, and they also don't require the provisioning of management facilities. And so we were working with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy as they aim to move towards more widespread recommendations of bear canisters along the AT. And so the ATC holds a leadership role in terms of the protection, promotion, and management of AT natural and cultural resources. And so we had identified this management need in terms of gaining an understanding of innovative methods for achieving compliance with food storage recommendations and regulations that can help to protect both people and bears along the trail. And so the goal of our study was to explore Appalachian Trail users' attitudes, norms, perceptions, and behavioral intentions regarding the use of bear canisters along the trail. So our theoretical framework was based on the theory of planned behavior. And so under this framework, attitudes, which are people's positive or negative evaluations toward the behavior of interest, subjective norms, which are the perceived social pressures that people feel to engage or not engage in the behavior, as well as perceived behavioral control, which is the extent to which a person perceives that the behavior is under their voluntary control, are all thought to directly predict behavioral intentions. And so a behavioral intention is simply just the likelihood to which a person is to engage in that behavior in the future. And those intentions are thought to directly predict the actual behavior. And so for our methodology, we developed a survey instrument in consultation with the ATC based on prior literature using the theory of planned behavior related variables representing attitudes, norms, perceived behavioral control, and intentions. And we used a Qualtrics online survey platform to help us gather our data and followed the Dillman method to send out various emails to our potential respondents. And so our sample was made up from known contacts from the AT Camp listserv. And so these were folks who had gone on an overnight trip on the AT the year prior. And our overall sample size after data cleaning was 1,668 respondents with a response rate of 63%. And so just a general overview here of some of the descriptive results that we found in our survey. When measuring attitudes, we found that generally we had a number of items that were measured on 7-point bipolar scales, where the lowest number was the least positive attitude, the highest number was the most positive attitude. We found that overall attitudes towards bear canisters were pretty unfavorable. The one exception to this was that we found a higher mean where people did agree that there was some value to using bear canisters. And so we'll come back to this later on. But again, here with our subjective norms, for instance, we asked people about these perceived pressures. So most people who are important to me think I should carry a bear canister as one example. We found that respondents were really feeling a low social pressure from their personal contacts. The exception to this particular item was the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. People did perceive a degree of pressure from the ATC to carry canisters along the trail. We had one item that measured perceived behavioral control. The usage of a bear canister is my decision to make, and we found that PBC was high. And so we had 3 items measuring behavioral intentions, and those were intent to use canisters where they are not required. And on their next trip, both of those items had low mean scores, and the intent to carry canisters where they would be required was actually found to be high. And so you'll see here in our TPP measurement model, we ran a confirmatory factor analysis and also used reliability statistics to test and to determine whether there's a strong fit between the data and our theory of planned behavior model. And we did actually identify 2 specific managerial conditions, which is no surprise given the means that we just saw on the previous slide. And so essentially we use these TPP constructs to then predict intent to carry canisters under these 2 specific conditions. The first are voluntary conditions, so carrying a bear canister where they aren't required and on a person's next trip, and then where they might be required on the trail. And so we used a structural equation model approach to then test these hypothesized paths under the TPB model and to predict intent to carry canisters under these two distinct managerial conditions. So we found that under voluntary conditions, attitudes and subjective norms predicted intentions to carry canisters, but all three TPB constructs predicted intent to carry under required conditions. And so essentially what we did in our write-up that went back to the ATC and in our recent publication that is coming out here in the next couple of months is we use these different leverage points to craft some messaging that would leverage these different TPB constructs based on the relationship in these paths between the construct and the actual intent to carry. And so we found that there was a positive relationship between attitudes towards the behavior and intent to carry under the voluntary and required conditions. So one example of a interpretation message that could be disseminated to bolster canister use on the trail that would appeal to attitudes is an example of the following. So carry a bear canister, it's worth it to save a bear's life. So you might remember from earlier in our presentation that one item that really popped out as a more positive attitude was the value, how worthwhile it might be to carry that canister. So that's one way that attitudes could be leveraged here. Subjective norms also had a positive relationship under both managerial conditions. And so to lean into some of that perceived social pressure from the ATC, the following message might be effective. So the ATC believes you should carry a bear canister on the trail, use a bear canister to store your food. And then finally, we found that PBC had a negative but significant relationship under required conditions. And so this is not what we would expect to find under the theory of planned behavior model. We would not expect that inverse relationship there. And so we don't see the applied benefit of leveraging PBC beyond just making sure that if the regulations were to move to a more required type of condition, that this would be noted in any type of messaging that would be disseminated. So for example here, bear canisters are required on the trail. Carrying a bear canister might be difficult sometimes, but getting food out of a bear canister is difficult for bears all of the time. Help save a bear's life by carrying a canister on your backpacking trip. And so in conclusion, we use this theory of planned behavior application to provide some leverage points that might help overcome some current obstacles to bear canister use on the trail. We found in our study that most people are relying on these bear hangs, and only about 9 to 10% of folks are carrying canisters on the trail. And so using these leverage points through some interpretation and communication strategies, especially when considering different potential regulatory conditions, might be met with success in terms of bolstering compliance. And so our study demonstrates a theoretically based message framing in a new cross-boundary context. Previous research had been really constrained to the Yosemite National Park context with backcountry users there, and the AT is cooperatively managed amongst multiple Forest Service units, national park units, refuges, and state administered lands. And so this study provides a theoretical understanding of some leverage points that might be effective across different cross-boundary contexts here. And so finally, we did conduct this study using internet-based surveys during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we did have the ability to identify some valid and reliable TPB measures that could be tested in future wilderness designated studies, especially those that are experiencing human-bear conflicts, and potentially could be studied with other thru-hiker communities as well. And so with that, I would just really like to thank our collaborators, of course. So thanks to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for their commitment to this project, as well as the folks that we worked with at the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Really appreciate that. And we're a little bit behind schedule. I think we kind of stumbled off the starting block a bit, so we'll keep moving. Next up, we have Nathan Regner, Penn State University, and he's got a impressive social science body of work in wilderness, international, domestic context, as well as recreation. So take it away, Nathan.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. Hello, everyone. Let me get the screen sharing going on here, and we will. That one seems good. A little confirmation from someone that you're seeing my screen. Nice.
Looks good.
So, thank you very much. I'm going to speak with you today about some collaborative science engagement that a number of us have been working on around the Pacific Crest Trail. You'll see the names of our co-authors here, myself, Jeremy Wimpey of Applied Trails Research, Virginia Tech, Fletcher Miadama down at Virginia Tech, and I've also listed U.S. Forest Service, U.S. National Park Service, and Pacific Crest Trail Association on here as co-authors because part of the story that I want to tell to you, and I think part of the direction, future direction for wilderness research that's important is truly collaborative work between those of us in the academy or professional researchers and the managers and managing partners with whom we work. So we're gonna touch on three little case studies briefly in this presentation. One about the relationship between the Pacific Crest Trail and National Scenic Trail and wilderness areas, both federal and state designated wilderness areas. We're going to talk a little bit about transbound issues around wilderness permitting in the transboundary context along the Pacific Crest Trail, and some manager engagement about data and information needs for the future. So, thinking about future directions for wilderness research and what our collaborative experience along the PCT can help teach us. One thing is sometimes back to basics is in fact the way to go. So the Pacific Crest Trail is 2,650 miles long, give or take, traverses 47 federally designated wilderness areas and 3 state wilderness areas. And we may think in our mind's eye of a wilderness area with a boundary and the trail running through the middle of it, a nice clean spatial arrangement like that. But it turns out that's not necessarily so. Features like National Scenic Trails, the Pacific Crest Trail, bob and weave in and out of wilderness boundaries, sometimes running directly along the boundary itself. And so if we're trying to coordinate management of national scenic trails and wilderness areas, it's important to recognize that there's a complex spatial relationship between these. There's some results of some spatial analysis on the screen here conducted by Fletcher Miadama, who deserves a lot of credit for this harder than expected task. And this is for the Sierra Nevada region in California, one of the largest contiguous wilderness areas, particularly in the lower 48. And what we can see in this data is, while this is a very large area of contiguous wilderness, the Pacific Crest Trail's path through it often departs from wilderness, sometimes for just a few feet, sometimes for a few miles. To visitors, this may be a seamless wilderness experience, but any manager out there knows that the crossing of the boundary in and out of wilderness has a great deal of ramifications for the types of decisions that are made and the types of management that are possible. So sometimes simply quantifying or simply describing the relationship between features like a national scenic trail and wilderness areas is really the most helpful type of research or analysis that might be needed. So we take this theme of transboundary issues, of a trail crossing from one unit or one designation into another, and we think about, well, what does that mean for visitors? In a place like the Central Sierra out in California, one thing that means for visitors is if they are on a transboundary trip, like a through or section hike on the PCT, a hike along the John Muir Trail, they need to have a wilderness permit that's valid across multiple wilderness areas, hopefully without needing to get an individual permit for an individual wilderness areas. as the Forest Service and Park Service managers in this region of the country begin to collaborate among themselves to facilitate these transboundary trips, they realized that there was a need immediately for simply understanding how their permit systems interact with each other. And so as a research team, we got together, we plumbed the depths of the history of these permitting programs and looked into how visitors can flow from one unit to another on wilderness permits. These little circle diagrams we have here try to illustrate that. Arrows pointing out means a permit from my unit is accepted in other units. Arrows pointing in means that I will honor a wilderness permit written by another unit in mine. And what we see in this contiguous block of wilderness out in California is a very diverse set of permit recognition, and in fact, no one unit has a similar pattern to any other unit. And so step number one then for bringing some coherence into the wilderness permitting in this system is simply understanding how do all of these permit systems interact with each other. In the spirit of understanding how units interact with each other, we also embarked upon a program of manager engagement to try and understand what are the data and research and science needs for this area. So together, our research team collaborated with 35 representatives of federal, state, and partner managing organizations up and down the trail to look at, hey, how do you think visitor use has changed in this area over the past several years? Everybody says visitor use is on the rise, and particularly use of the PCT is on the rise. Then we asked, okay, do you feel like there are increasing issues or decreasing issues associated with that increase in use? And are the resources available to you to address them increasing along with that? And we see here a very distinct crossing pattern in this data that virtually while all issues are increasing, available resources to address them are decreasing throughout the PCT. I'm going to leave this slide set, Chris. I know we've got a clock ticking. I'm just going to leave this set for a minute, allow people a moment to read. And so if we're thinking about directions for wilderness research in the future, our managers told us in this engagement that those research directions ought to focus on understanding shifting patterns of use, shifting patterns in time and space, understanding how people are acting differently. So the distribution in time and space is changing. Also, what people are doing when they're out there is changing. And as those changes occur, the distance between the conventional management approaches, and I think the conventional wisdom among managers, and the motivations, experiences of visitors, that distance is increasing with time. So I want to thank you for spending just a few minutes with us here, and leave you with the message that in the future, effective wilderness research will be engaged in collaborative researchers and managers working together, and will take into account the experience and interests of managers and how they are similar to or different than the experiences and interests of visitors. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Nathan, for that. That was great. We've got 10 minutes or so for some Q&A, and it's worth noting that a lot of those questions that have been asked already have kind of been answered in the chat, but if you've got any follow-ups, feel free to put them in there. If you have any targeted questions beyond what's in the chat for our excellent speakers, then you can voice those now. There's also so we've got chat and we've got Q&A. There's kind of the chat box too, and there's some interesting conversation going on in there. Pete, always a wealth of good information. Thanks for that. And so let me see. We got one open question idea. Eric asks, this is probably to you, Nathan, any idea if Guthook and other apps collaborate well with managers on other national scenic trails?
I can't speak knowledgeably about that. I do know along the Pacific Crest Trail that there is an open line of dialogue and an interest to bring that information together. There's also an appreciation that that visitors more and more are seeking these third-party or external sources of information, and that I think is a great challenge for managers as it's not that their authority no longer has power. It's just that maybe they're competing in a much more open marketplace for information.
Thanks, Nathan. Diana asks, any sense of why hikers don't want to use bear canisters? So this is for you, Stephanie. The group you use is probably more compliant than most hikers since they bothered to register voluntarily.
Yeah, absolutely. So we found that the majority of participants were using some type of hang, whether PCT or otherwise. Only about 9% were carrying bear canisters. And so what I didn't report on here is we also asked quite a number of underlying belief items for folks, many of which were trying to get at some of what those barriers might be for folks. And so we found numerous things related really specifically to the actual design of the canister themselves. So the bulk of the canister, the weight, the perhaps cost or the ability to rent one if that's something of interest to folks. There are really a lot of design features that are, I think, a pretty big turnoff for a number of backpackers. And so that's something that wasn't necessarily too surprising to us, but that's really the benefit of this theoretically based message framing, is trying to appeal. And even though we understand that attitudes might be poor and perceived social pressures to carry them might also be low, what are some sort of middle of the road or on the higher end positive attitudes, or who are those folks that they are perceiving pressure from that maybe we can sort of lean into to create a bit more compliance in that way. One thing that did come out of our study that is very heartening and good to know is that if the regulations did shift and bear canisters were required along the trail, intentions to use them are high. And so there's likely to be compliance, but under voluntary conditions, intentions are pretty low, and we attribute that to a lot of the design elements.
Great, thanks for that, Stephanie. We had a comment, and I'm not seeing any other questions, so just note a comment in the chat related to the Guthook question. Justin shares, I can share that Guthook has been open and willing to work with PCTA to highlight information such as trail closures or campsites that help protect areas along the PCT. So good to know. Thanks, Justin. Randy's got a question. What are the best social media apps for sharing experiences in wilderness and along trails? And I guess that could be anybody or everybody. Any ideas there?
Well, Instagram, of course.
Instagram. Yeah, I'm sure some of the more targeted sites too, in terms of blogs and things like that, but I guess you're asking about social media. Pete's got a question for Jaclyn. Curious about how much Jaclyn engaged with the Interagency Visitor Use Management Group.
Thanks, Pete. We didn't bring in too much of the IVUM into this review. I've engaged with them in other research that I've done. But the way that we had our inclusion criteria, I got actually our definition for visitor use management from IVUM. But in terms of the actual empirical research that went into the review, the IVUM is informed by empirical research, such as the review is informed, but it's focused more on developing the framework, right, for understanding and for managing for visitor use management. And so it would be really interesting to go back and compare our results to the IVUM and look at how the research over the past 20 years supports IVUM, or whether there are misalignments there or gaps in that knowledge.
Thanks, Jaclyn. We got about 4 minutes left. There is a kudos in the chat there from Sarah Rodriguez, Carson National Forest. She says great research and presentation. Then Cable gives a kudos as well. We got another question from Kelly Muller. Question for Nathan. Is your research being used by the agencies in the PCTA to inform management decisions regarding the wilderness permit system in the Central Sierra region?
Well, you know, that would be a better question for managers and PCTA. It is my sense that it is. It is my sense that this type of collaborative and engaged science that we're doing provides a platform on which discussions can occur. Sort of a meeting point that managers from different units and their management partners can gather around. I think about it as fuel for the engine of management, so to speak. Not setting a direction, not saying thou shalt, but enabling and empowering.
Great, thanks, Nathan. I see a couple comments and thank yous there. Some comments on, Diana notes for the AT, there are many popular user groups on Facebook. Good to know.
Chris, just to note that I did bring Will Rice and Jason Taylor in as panelists to get
all right
set up, but I haven't yet seen Teresa.
Thanks, Randy. I don't think Teresa will be making it today, but we'll move on without her and get her done. I'll stand in a little bit there. Welcome, Will. Welcome, Jason. I do have one more question, it seems, from Luna. Are managers concerned about bears considering allowing your sacks rather than requiring bear canisters? Are they, okay, the managers were concerned about bears. Are they considering allowing your sacks rather than requiring bear canisters? Your sacks have a better design feature for backpackers. Anything to say on that, Stephanie?
So my sense is that depending on who you ask, I think different managers maybe have different perceptions on this issue. I know more intimately from the ATC that they are interested in moving more towards bear canisters that are IGBC certified, which are essentially designed in such a way that are to prevent bears from gaining access to human food. And so, but I do think that this is something that will be an ongoing conversation for sure as we move forward and trying to overcome some of these issues in terms of design. We're just not quite there yet. And so I think it sort of depends on who you ask.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Not seeing any other questions right now, and we're at the top of the hour. So I guess I just end with a big thanks to all our speakers. Thank you all for attending and all the questions as well. And we're going to move in now to a more discussion on research and kind of directions of future research with a presentation on the science planning related to the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Charter. Jason Taylor's